What if God isn't lost, but waiting to be born in you? Consider the profound paradox at the heart of our spiritual seeking. For millennia, we've searched for the divine beyond ourselves, in distant heavens, in transcendent realms, in perfect beings far removed from human limitation. We've built elaborate theologies, grand cathedrals, and complex rituals all oriented toward connecting with something sacred that exists somewhere else. Yet despite these centuries of upward-oriented seeking, something curious has happened. The more desperately we've searched for God beyond humanity, the more distant the divine has seemed to become. The more elaborate our explanations of transcendent perfection, the less connected we've felt to actual sacredness. This pattern becomes even more fascinating when we consider those rare moments when people report authentic spiritual experience. What's striking about these experiences is that they don't typically involve escaping human consciousness, but rather entering more fully into it. In these moments, the divine doesn't appear as distant perfection, but as immanent reality discovered through rather than beyond human awareness. Consider also the evolution of spiritual understanding across cultures. While early religious frameworks often imagined gods as external powers to be appeased, more mature spiritual traditions increasingly recognized divinity as something to be realized within human consciousness itself. From the Upanishadic insight that Atman is Brahman, to the Christian notion that the kingdom of God is within you, to Sufi understanding that he who knows himself knows his Lord, we find a consistent pattern of spiritual evolution. This observation points toward a revolutionary possibility. What if the sacred isn't something that exists in perfect completion elsewhere, but something that's in the process of becoming through human consciousness itself? What if divinity isn't a distant reality to connect with, but an emergent potential to be realized through our own evolution? What if God isn't dead or missing, but waiting to be born through us? This perspective would transform our understanding of spiritual seeking itself. The divine wouldn't be something to find, but something to become. The sacred wouldn't exist in static perfection, but would continually evolve through the development of consciousness. Heaven wouldn't be somewhere else to go, but something to bring into being through our own transformation. This isn't abstract speculation, but a fundamental reorientation with profound implications. If divinity isn't fixed reality but creative possibility, then the meaning of existence itself shifts from finding what already exists to participating in what's still emerging. We wouldn't be creatures seeking creator, but co-creators participating in ongoing creation. One philosopher looked deeply into this possibility and emerged with a revolutionary insight, that what we've called God isn't something transcendent to be worshipped, but something immanent to be realized. That divinity isn't found through ascending beyond the human condition, but through transforming it from within. Have you ever considered that your spiritual seeking might be oriented in the wrong direction? That the divine you've imagined dwelling in distant perfection might actually be waiting to emerge through your own evolving consciousness? There's a curious inconsistency in how we understand the relationship between the human and the divine. We simultaneously hold two contradictory conceptions of the sacred. On one hand, we imagine divinity as utterly transcendent, perfect, unchanging, and completely separate from human limitation. On the other hand, we intuitively recognize the divine in precisely those moments when human consciousness transcends its ordinary boundaries and touches something greater than itself. Consider how this anomaly appears in our cultural narratives and religious frameworks. We build theological systems that place God in absolute transcendence, beyond all human qualities and limitations. Yet simultaneously, we tell stories of divine incarnation, of God becoming human, of the sacred manifesting through rather than separate from humanity. This anomaly becomes even more striking when we examine actual spiritual experience. Those who report genuine encounter with the sacred rarely describe connecting with something utterly alien to human consciousness. Rather, they typically describe discovering something that feels simultaneously deeply familiar and vastly greater than their ordinary awareness. Not a foreign entity, but an expanded dimension of consciousness itself. What makes this pattern particularly revealing is how it contradicts our cultural emphasis on separation between human and divine. We're taught to seek God through rejecting human limitation, to to find the sacred by escaping earthly existence, to connect with heaven by overcoming our embodied nature. Yet the evidence of direct experience suggests something quite different. That authentic encounter with the divine typically comes not through rejecting humanity, but through entering it more completely. This contradiction points toward a radical possibility. What if the divine isn't something separate from humanity, but something emerging through it? What if God isn't fixed reality to be discovered, but creative potential to be realized? What if the sacred isn't dwelling in distant perfection, but awakening through the evolution of consciousness itself? This perspective would resolve the paradox of why authentic spiritual experience feels simultaneously transcendent and immanent, beyond ordinary. Awareness yet discovered within consciousness itself. It would explain why divine encounter often seems both utterly new and deeply familiar, not connection with foreign entity, but awakening to greater dimension of our own nature. This understanding emerged from the thinking of a philosopher who recognized that conventional conceptions of God as separate, perfect entity had become increasingly untenable in the modern world. Yet rather than simply accepting the death of God as the end of the sacred, he glimpsed something profoundly different, the possibility that what we've called God might not be dying but being born in a new way, not as transcendent being separate from humanity, but as immanent potential awakening through human consciousness itself. Have you ever noticed how your most authentic spiritual moments have typically involved not escaping your humanity, but discovering something greater within it? How the divine hasn't appeared as something utterly separate from your consciousness, but as deeper dimension of that consciousness itself. The year is 1883. In a modest room in Rapallo, Italy, a solitary figure works with unusual intensity on a manuscript unlike anything he has written before. He is 38 years old, without academic position, family, or conventional success. His published works have been largely ignored or misunderstood. His health is fragile. Debilitating migraines, severe digestive distress, and partial blindness regularly interrupt his work. Yet despite these apparent limitations, he is experiencing a period of extraordinary creative vision. This is Friedrich Nietzsche, and the manuscript that absorbs him will become Thus Spoke Zarathustra, a work he later describes as having been written in states of inspiration so powerful they felt like possession. One hears, one does not seek, one takes, one does not ask who gives. A thought suddenly flashes up like lightning. It comes with necessity, without faltering. I have never had any choice in the matter. What makes this context particularly significant is how it embodies the very insight that Nietzsche's work would articulate, that the divine isn't something transcendent to be worshipped, but something immanent to be realized, not perfect being separate from human limitation, but creative becoming that manifests through those very limitations. This understanding emerged from Nietzsche's unique intellectual and personal journey. Born in 1844 to a Lutheran pastor, he grew up immersed in traditional Christianity, with its sharp separation between divine perfection and human limitation. His subsequent education led him to classical philology, the study of ancient languages and texts, where he encountered pre-Christian Greek culture that celebrated divine forces manifesting through rather than separate from human experience. But perhaps most significant was Nietzsche's direct confrontation with the profound spiritual crisis of his era. The scientific revolution, historical criticism, and philosophical skepticism had increasingly undermined traditional religious frameworks. The God conceived as separate entity existing in transcendent perfection had become, in Nietzsche's famous phrase, dead, no longer credible within modern understanding. For many, this development represented simply the end of the sacred, the disenchantment of existence, the loss of transcendent meaning. But Nietzsche perceived something profoundly different, not just the death of God as separate entity, but the potential birth of the divine as immanent reality, not the end of the sacred, but its relocation from transcendent realm to creative possibility within human becoming itself. This insight found its fullest expression in Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch or Overman, often misunderstood as celebration of domination, but actually representing the emergence of sacred possibility within humanity itself. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he expresses this through his prophet's declaration. Man is a rope stretched between animal and overman, a rope over an abyss. What is great in man is that he is a bridge and not a goal. What distinguishes Nietzsche's understanding from conventional spirituality isn't rejection of the divine, but transformation of how we conceive it. His famous proclamation that God is dead wasn't atheistic dismissal, but recognition that the sacred can no longer be credibly located in separate perfect entity. The revolutionary aspect of Nietzsche's insight is his recognition that the death of God as separate entity doesn't mean the end of the sacred, but the necessary condition for its rebirth within human consciousness itself. The sacred isn't found by looking upward beyond humanity, but by looking inward to what humanity might become. Have you ever experienced moments of inspiration where something seemed to flow through you that felt simultaneously deeply personal and greater than your ordinary self? Could these experiences be glimpses of precisely the sacred potential within human consciousness that Nietzsche recognized? Nietzsche's investigation into the birth of the divine within human consciousness began with careful observation of how the sacred actually manifests in human experience. Through both historical analysis and psychological insight, he identified a pattern that contradicted conventional understanding. Authentic encounter with the divine typically occurs not through rejecting humanity, but through transforming it from within, not by escaping limitation, but by engaging it with greater consciousness and creativity. In The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche explores this pattern through his analysis of ancient Greek culture. He examines how the Greeks experienced divinity not primarily as transcendent reality separate from humanity, but as immanent force manifesting through human creativity, passion, and insight. The god Dionysus in particular represented not escape from the human condition, but its transformation through ecstatic consciousness. Moments when ordinary awareness expanded to touch something simultaneously deeply human and vastly greater. Perhaps the most compelling evidence comes from Nietzsche's examination of creative experience. In The Gay Science, he explores how artistic inspiration involves consciousness temporarily accessing something that feels simultaneously deeply personal and transpersonal. One no longer has any idea what is image or metaphor. Everything presents itself as the readiest, truest, simplest means of expression. The creator becomes channel for possibility greater than individual personality, yet realized precisely through that personality's unique expression. Similar patterns appear in Nietzsche's analysis of other transformative experiences. In his examination of love, he observes how authentic connection doesn't involve escaping individuality, but discovering something universal through completely personal engagement. In his study of insight, he notes how wisdom emerges not by rejecting particular perspective, but by allowing that perspective to expand beyond its usual boundaries. These diverse manifestations of the same pattern led Nietzsche to a revolutionary understanding. The divine isn't something separate from humanity, but something emerging through humanity's self-transcendence. As he writes in Beyond Good and Evil, the noble soul has reverence for itself, not meaning narcissistic self-worship, but recognition that what we've called divinity is discovered through, rather than beyond human consciousness. This insight finds expression in Nietzsche's concept of self-overcoming, Selbstüberwindung, which appears throughout his mature work. This isn't mere self-improvement, but the evolution of consciousness beyond its current limitations, the continuous transcendence that doesn't abandon humanity, but transforms it from within. As he expresses in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, man is something that shall be overcome. What have you done to overcome him? This overcoming isn't rejection of humanity, but its evolution towards sacred potential. Nietzsche's personal notebooks reveal how directly this insight emerged from his own experience. During periods of extraordinary creativity, he documented states of consciousness where something seemed to flow through him that felt simultaneously deeply personal and greater than his individual self. These weren't supernatural interventions, but moments when his own consciousness temporarily transcended its ordinary boundaries, accessing dimensions of possibility and understanding that normal awareness couldn't reach. These experiences convinced Nietzsche that what humans have traditionally projected onto external deities actually represents intuition of our own evolutionary potential, not separate reality, but emergent possibility within consciousness itself. The divine isn't something existing in perfect completion elsewhere, but something in the process of becoming through us. Have you experienced moments when your consciousness seemed to temporarily transcend its ordinary boundaries and touch something that felt simultaneously deeply personal and greater than your individual self? Could these moments be glimpses of precisely the sacred potential within consciousness that Nietzsche recognized? As Nietzsche deepened his investigation into the birth of the divine within human consciousness, he encountered a profound question. If authentic spirituality involves not connecting with transcendent deity, but realizing sacred potential within humanity itself, why has religious understanding persistently located divinity elsewhere? In On the Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche explores how certain religious frameworks systematically reinforce separation between human and divine by designating human qualities, embodiment, change, desire, creativity, as fallen, sinful, or limited in contrast to divine perfection, unchanging completeness, and disembodied purity. This dichotomy originated not from direct spiritual insight, but from psychological need to locate ultimate value beyond the vulnerability and limitation that define human experience. This insight led Nietzsche to recognize how specific cultural forms institutionalize this projection of the sacred. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he examines how religious structures often function less as pathways to authentic spiritual experience than as mechanisms for maintaining the sacred's externalization. They called God that which opposed and afflicted them, and verily, there was much of the heroic in their adoration. This isn't simplistic criticism, but recognition of how spiritual frameworks that begin as responses to genuine intuition frequently evolve into systems that prevent direct realization of the sacred within human consciousness itself. What makes these patterns particularly powerful is how they align with psychological tendencies that Nietzsche identified as fundamental to human development. In Beyond Good and Evil, he analyzes how consciousness naturally externalizes value, projecting meaning onto separate realities rather than recognizing it as creative possibility emerging through consciousness itself. This projection isn't mere error, but mechanism that allows nascent awareness to evolve through relationship with what appears as other, a necessary developmental stage that becomes limiting when mistaken for final truth. The result of these combined forces, psychological, cultural, religious, is what Nietzsche diagnosed as humanity's fundamental self-misunderstanding, the persistent location of the sacred beyond rather than within human becoming. By projecting the divine onto separate reality, we simultaneously elevate it beyond human reach and diminish the sacred potential of human consciousness itself. We create gods we can worship precisely because we cannot become them, objects of devotion rather than possibilities for transformation. This understanding led Nietzsche to a revolutionary insight. Authentic spirituality requires not better techniques for connecting with external divinity, but fundamental reorientation toward the divine as emergent possibility within human consciousness itself. It demands what he calls the transvaluation of all values, not just questioning specific beliefs, but transforming the very structure of valuation that has traditionally placed the sacred beyond, rather than within human becoming. In his personal notebooks, Nietzsche sometimes described this reorientation as the shift from otherworldly to this-worldly spirituality, not meaning materialistic rejection of transcendence, but recognition that genuine transcendence is discovered through immanence, that the sacred emerges not beyond earthly existence, but through its transformation. This isn't diminishment of spiritual aspiration, but its intensification, directing religious impulse not toward connection with what already exists in perfection elsewhere, but toward participation in what's still emerging here. Have you noticed how traditional spiritual frameworks often reinforce separation between human and divine, locating the sacred always elsewhere, beyond, above human experience? Could your own spiritual intuition be pointing not toward connection with separate reality, but toward realization of emergent possibility within your own evolving awareness? As Nietzsche continued his exploration, a profound pattern began to emerge. What we've traditionally projected onto external deities actually represents intuition of our own evolutionary potential, not separate reality, but emergent possibility within consciousness itself. The divine isn't something existing in perfect completion elsewhere, but something in the process of becoming through us. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche articulates this pattern through his prophet's declaration: God is a conjecture, but I desire that your conjectures should be limited by what is thinkable. Could you think a God? But this is what the will to truth should mean to you, that everything be changed into what is humanly thinkable, humanly visible, humanly feelable. This isn't atheistic rejection, but profound reorientation, recognition that authentic spirituality involves not connection with transcendent deity, but realization of sacred potential within humanity itself. What makes this pattern particularly significant is how it transforms our understanding of spiritual evolution. Nietzsche observed how religious frameworks typically begin with projection of the sacred onto external realities, creating gods that represent intuition of human potential in amplified form. These projections serve important developmental function, allowing nascent consciousness to relate to possibilities it can't yet fully embody. But authentic spiritual maturation involves gradually recognizing these deities, not as separate entities, but as creative possibilities emerging through humanity itself, not objects of worship, but potentials for becoming. This perspective appears in Nietzsche's analysis of how different cultures have conceived the relationship between human and divine. In Beyond Good and Evil, he explores how spiritual understanding evolves from primitive externalization, where gods are separate powers to be appeased, to more sophisticated recognition of the divine as emergent dimension within consciousness itself. The spiritual height and power of a people has always first shown itself by the way in which it interprets its God and by what it considered divine. The pattern extends to individual development as well. Nietzsche observed how personal spiritual growth typically proceeds from projection, locating the sacred in external authority or reality, to integration, recognizing the divine as emergent possibility within one's own consciousness. This evolution doesn't diminish spiritual significance, but deepens it, shifting from passive worship of what exists elsewhere to active participation in what's emerging here. Perhaps most profoundly, this pattern reshapes our understanding of creativity itself. If the divine isn't something complete elsewhere, but something still emerging through human consciousness, then creative acts aren't merely aesthetic expressions, but participation in ongoing creation of the sacred. The artist, scientist, philosopher, or innovator who brings new possibility into being isn't just making culture, but participating in the continuous birth of what we've called divine. Not connecting with separate reality, but channeling emergent potential through their own unique expression. This creative understanding appears in Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch or overman, not superior being in hierarchical sense, but humanity that has recognized and begun to realize its own sacred potential. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he expresses this through his prophet's teaching. I teach you the overman. Man is something that shall be overcome. What have you done to overcome him? This overcoming isn't rejection of humanity, but its evolution toward divine possibility. Not escaping the human condition, but transforming it from within. Not worshiping transcendent perfection, but participating in immanent becoming. Have you recognized in your own spiritual journey a gradual shift from seeking the divine as separate reality to discovering it as emergent dimension of your own consciousness? How has your relationship with the sacred evolved from projection onto external authority to recognition of creative possibility emerging through your own awareness? The implications of Nietzsche's insight into the birth of the divine within human consciousness extend far beyond abstract philosophy, revolutionizing our understanding of spiritual purpose, meaning, creativity, and even the fundamental nature of existence. First, this perspective transforms our understanding of spiritual purpose. Traditional frameworks typically present the sacred journey as movement toward what already exists in perfection, connection with divine reality that remains unchanged by human participation. But if divinity is emergent possibility rather than fixed entity, then authentic spirituality wouldn't involve reaching what's already complete, but participating in what's still being created. As Nietzsche writes in The Gay Science, the concept of revelation, in the sense that suddenly, with ineffable certainty and subtlety, something becomes visible, audible, something that shakes one to the core and bowls one over, simply describes the fact. This revelation isn't disclosure of what exists elsewhere, but awakening to creative potential emerging through consciousness itself. This reframing resolves the paradox many experience between spiritual aspiration and worldly engagement. We often feel divided between seeking transcendent meaning and creating immanent value, between connecting with what exists beyond human limitation and bringing new possibility into being through human creativity. From Nietzsche's perspective, this isn't genuine contradiction, but artificial separation based on misconception of the divine-human relationship. If the sacred emerges through rather than beyond humanity, then spiritual development wouldn't involve escaping earthly existence but transforming it from within, not seeking heaven elsewhere but bringing it into being through our own evolution. Second, this insight revolutionizes our understanding of meaning itself. Conventional frameworks typically locate ultimate significance either in conformity to divine purpose, religious perspective, or in human projects that attempt to compensate for cosmic meaninglessness, existentialist view. Nietzsche's vision transcends both approaches by recognizing that meaning isn't something found complete either in transcendent purpose or human invention alone, but something continuously created through the interaction between evolving consciousness and existence itself. This perspective doesn't diminish meaning's significance but deepens it, shifting from passive discovery of what already exists to active participation in ongoing creation. Value isn't found primarily in fixed principles or transcendent ideals, but in the continuous evolution that brings new possibility into being. As Nietzsche expresses in Beyond Good and Evil, anything that is has been interpreted to the hilt, for the concept anything that is already the result of a belief, a making the same. Third, this understanding transforms our conception of creativity itself. If the divine isn't something separate from humanity but something emerging through it, then creative acts aren't merely cultural expressions, but participation in the continuous birth of the sacred. The artist, scientist, philosopher, or innovator who brings new possibility into being isn't just making product, but channeling emergent potential that genuinely transcends ordinary awareness. As Nietzsche writes in Twilight of the Idols, art is the great stimulus to life. How could one understand it as purposeless, as aimless, as l'art pour l'art? Perhaps most profoundly, this insight transforms our relationship with existence itself. If the sacred isn't something complete elsewhere but something still emerging through us, then the meaning of life isn't found by connecting with what already exists in perfection, but by participating in what's still being created. We aren't separate from divine reality, but expressions through which that reality continues to evolve. Not creatures seeking creator, but co-creators involved in ongoing creation. Have you experienced how your most profound moments of meaning and purpose have typically come not through escaping your humanity, but through expressing it more fully, not by separating from earthly existence, but by engaging it with greater creativity and presence? If Nietzsche's insight about the birth of the divine within human consciousness is so profound, why hasn't it fundamentally transformed our spiritual understanding? Why do we remain fixated on seeking the sacred beyond, rather than within humanity? Religious institutions have been perhaps the most obvious force reinforcing this externalization. In The Antichrist, Nietzsche analyzes how established churches typically function, not as pathways to direct spiritual experience, but as intermediaries that maintain separation between humanity and divinity. The church has the same interests as the I. Weak, because it is weak itself. This weakness isn't physical but conceptual, dependence on frameworks that place the sacred beyond human becoming rather than within it. By positioning themselves as necessary mediators between humanity and external God, religious institutions secure their own authority while simultaneously preventing the recognition that what we've called divine might actually be emergent possibility within consciousness itself. This pattern extends beyond traditional religions to secular systems that similarly profit from maintaining separation between humanity and its sacred potential. Educational frameworks typically teach established knowledge rather than creative capacities that might transform that knowledge. Political structures emphasize representation of existing interests rather than evolution toward new possibilities. Economic systems reward production of commodity rather than manifestation of genuinely novel value. What makes these patterns particularly powerful is how they align with psychological tendencies that Nietzsche identified as fundamental to human development. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he explores how consciousness naturally externalizes possibility, projecting potentials it can't yet fully embody onto separate realities it can relate to without having to become. Once the people thought of God as themselves, and now you think it even more human than that. But whatever it is that you call human, that is a fraction and piece of humanity, and a monstrous caricature and horror, and often even carrion and clay. The result of these combined forces, institutional and psychological, is what Nietzsche diagnosed as humanity's fundamental self-alienation, the persistent location of our own sacred potential outside ourselves rather than within our own becoming. In The Will to Power, he describes this as the denaturalization of values, the displacement of meaning and significance from their origin in evolving consciousness onto external realities that then appear to grant rather than receive their value. These insights led Nietzsche to recognize that liberation from this self-alienation isn't achieved through better techniques for connecting with external divinity, but through fundamental transformation in how we understand the relationship between humanity and the sacred. It requires what he calls the death of God, not atheistic denial, but necessary dissolution of our projection of divinity onto separate entity. Have you noticed how various cultural frameworks, religious, educational, political, often reinforce separation between human and divine? How systems that claim to connect us with the sacred frequently maintain the very division they ostensibly seek to overcome? If Nietzsche's insight about the birth of the divine within human consciousness is so liberating, why has it been consistently misunderstood, marginalized, or actively suppressed? The answers reveal how profoundly threatening this understanding is to established frameworks of meaning, systems of authority, and our own psychological defenses. First, Nietzsche's vision fundamentally threatens traditional religious and metaphysical systems by suggesting that divinity isn't something separate from humanity, but something emerging through it. He undermines frameworks that derive their authority from maintaining the division between human and sacred. His famous declaration that God is dead isn't simply atheistic rejection, but recognition that authentic spirituality requires abandonment of our projection of the divine onto external entity. This explains why religious interpretations of Nietzsche have consistently distorted his thought, casting him as merely destructive, the philosopher who proclaimed the death of God without offering alternative. But this caricature misses his actual position. As he writes in The Gay Science, "What I am now going to relate is the history of the next 2 centuries. After Buddha was dead, his shadow was still shown for centuries in a cave, a tremendous, gruesome shadow. God is dead, but given the way of men, there may still be caves for thousands of years in which his shadow will be shown." Nietzsche wasn't simply negating traditional spirituality, but pointing toward more profound understanding, one that recognizes the sacred not as separate reality, but as creative possibility emerging through human becoming itself. Second, Nietzsche's insight threatens established power structures that derive legitimacy from positioning themselves as necessary intermediaries between humanity and its own sacred potential. A culture that recognized divinity as emergent potential within human consciousness would develop fundamentally different institutions, ones oriented toward facilitating evolution rather than maintaining separation between humanity and its sacred possibilities. Third, and perhaps most significantly, Nietzsche's perspective challenges our psychological dependence on external authority. If divinity isn't something separate that grants meaning and value from beyond humanity, but creative possibility emerging through human consciousness itself, then we face far more demanding task than traditional spirituality requires. Rather than connecting with what already exists in perfection elsewhere, we must participate in bringing the sacred into being through our own transformation, not worship what is complete, but realize what is still becoming. As Nietzsche writes in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, "Dead are all the gods, now we want the overman to live." This isn't arrogant self-deification, but recognition that authentic spirituality involves not submission to external divinity, but realization of divine potential within, a far more challenging orientation that many find too demanding to sustain. What makes this resistance particularly ironic is that the experience Nietzsche points toward isn't foreign to human consciousness, but one of its most fundamental capacities. Moments of inspiration, insight, creative flow, profound connection. These aren't supernatural interventions, but instances when our awareness temporarily transcends its ordinary boundaries and touches something simultaneously deeply personal and greater than individual self. The final question isn't whether Nietzsche was right about the birth of the divine within human consciousness. The evidence increasingly suggests he glimpsed something profound about the relationship between humanity and the sacred. The question is, what it means to live as if this understanding were true. The transformation begins with fundamental shift in spiritual orientation. Instead of seeking the divine beyond ourselves, in transcendent realms, perfect entities, or absolute truths, we might recognize it as an emergent dimension within our own evolving consciousness. This doesn't mean reducing the sacred to human scale, but expanding humanity towards sacred possibility, not diminishing transcendent significance, but relocating it from external reality to creative potential being realized through our own becoming. As Nietzsche writes in The Gay Science, not mankind, but Overman is the goal. This isn't rejection of spiritual aspiration, but its intensification, directing religious impulse not toward connection with what already exists in completion, but toward participation in bringing what's still emerging into being. This reorientation doesn't mean abandoning religious wisdom or practice. Rather, it transforms our relationship with them. We engage spiritual traditions not as pathways to separate reality, but as technologies for awakening sacred potential within consciousness itself. Their value isn't measured by how successfully they connect us with external divinity, but by how effectively they facilitate our own evolution toward divine possibility. Perhaps most profoundly, this perspective transforms our understanding of creativity itself. If the divine isn't something separate from humanity, but something emerging through it, then creative acts aren't merely cultural expressions, but participation in the continuous birth of the sacred. The artist, scientist, philosopher, or innovator who brings new possibility into being isn't just making product, but channeling emergent potential that genuinely transcends ordinary awareness. This approach doesn't promise continuous transcendence or perfect realization. The birth of the divine within is ongoing process rather than completed achievement. Evolutionary movement rather than fixed state. We participate in this becoming not by reaching final destination, but by continuously transcending where we've been. Not by achieving perfect completeness, but by remaining open to emerging possibility. As Nietzsche expresses through Zarathustra, man is a rope stretched between animal and overman, a rope over an abyss. What is great in man is that he is a bridge and not a goal. If this perspective resonates with your experience, you've likely already glimpsed what Nietzsche describes. In moments when your consciousness temporarily transcended its ordinary boundaries and touched something simultaneously deeply personal and greater than your individual self. These weren't departures from reality, but encounters with its deeper nature. Not supernatural interventions, but natural evolution of consciousness toward greater possibility. The invitation isn't to reject traditional spirituality, but to transform our relationship with it, to recognize that what we've projected onto external deities may actually represent intuition of our own evolutionary potential. As he writes in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, I love him who lives to know, and who wants to know so that the overman may live someday. Have you begun to recognize that the God you've been seeking isn't missing or dead, but waiting to be born through you?